This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today's episode is all about getting lost on your travels. Who hasn't got lost when they've been travelling somewhere? I know it has happened to me probably hundreds of times. It's a common occurrence, but it's all part of the adventure most of the time. I think there are definitely some scary stories of getting lost and some funny stories of getting lost. I have already collected a few funny stories about getting lost for future episodes, but today, a little bit later, I have a couple of quite scary stories from some very interesting storytelling travellers. But first, I was trying to think about any kind of scary moments when I've been lost on my travels. I'm pretty good at getting lost. I'm not fantastic at reading a map, and I don't seem to have a really good sense of direction. I think the most common times I got lost was when I was living in Japan. I used to often go into a shopping centre and come out the wrong door and be completely lost in Japan. Japan doesn't make it easy either because they don't have a really logical address system. Their street numbers don't run numerically down the street. They have a kind of a grid system to find addresses. So that certainly doesn't help. And of course I couldn't read too much Japanese. But I never really felt worried. I couldn't classify any of those times as particularly scary stories. And the weird thing is, the time that really springs to mind is just a few years ago in Vienna, in Austria. I had flown to Vienna from Australia with my son, and I think this is what made it scary. I was there with my son, who was about 3 at the time, and it was the first time I'd gone overseas with him alone. My husband, who had work commitments, was going to join us a week or so later. So I had a few days in Vienna first with my son before we went to visit some friends in Slovakia. Now, I knew Vienna really well. When I lived in Bratislava, it's only about 50 kilometres from Vienna, and often on the weekend I would take the train over into Austria and walk around Vienna for the day. I had no money because I was earning Slovak crowns, but I liked to walk around, so I really knew Vienna quite well. Plus, I spoke German, so I should have felt really comfortable there. But I think it's because, as I said, it was the first time I was overseas with my son on our own, and I was a little bit anxious about that, and I didn't want anything to go too wrong. But in any case, I really wanted to take him to Hundertwasserhaus. If you don't know the artist Hundertwasser, look him up. I'll put some links in the show notes. But he has really colourful, crazy kind of art. And the Hundertwasserhaus is an art gallery, but it's a very special art gallery. The floors are all crooked and wonky. There's no straight walls. Every window is different. And everything is so colourful and bright. And I knew my son would love it. So I really wanted to take him there. And from where we were staying, I looked at the map and I figured we could walk there. He was still in a stroller at the time, so I could push him and I could walk there. I thought that would be no problem. We'd get to see a bit more of Vienna. It would be a lovely experience. So off we went. Now, this was the day after we'd flown in from Australia, so a long haul flight, and I was kind of aware that my son would have some boundaries for the day, that he would get tired and we would need to head back to the apartment where we were staying. So I felt a little bit under time pressure, but I looked at the map and off we went. And off we went, and off we went. And I kept walking, and then I would check my map, and I couldn't find the little streets that we were on my map. I guess my map was at too large a scale, and I couldn't always find the names of the streets or the little alleys that we were on. And I started to get lost, and I'd take another turn, and then I couldn't find us on the map again. And I'd walk a bit faster because, I don't know, walking faster helps, I guess. It made me feel better anyway. And my son would start complaining, and he was hungry and he was hot. It was summer in Vienna. It had been winter back in Australia. So he was understandably a bit put out by that, and jet lagged, of course. And I was starting to get a little bit nervous that, we would be really lost. I would take too long to find our way back. I'd never get to Hundertwasserhaus. I'd never get home, and it would all be a terrible disaster. I kept going, kept going, more and more anxious. I really felt that kind of fear that I probably hadn't really felt before when I got lost. As a solo traveller or with another adult, getting lost usually seemed just like an adventure to me and a way to discover new places. I never really had those restrictions of being solely responsible for a small child before when I was getting lost. So this was really a different getting lost experience. I finally found a couple of locals to chat to and find out where I was going wrong. The street seemed really empty that day. I don't know, it was the middle of a working day, I think, and no one was sort of walking around. And they pointed me in the right direction, and I realised that, my map was really kind of lacking in all the little alleyways going between the streets. And I finally got to Hundertwasser House, and I was so relieved. It was totally worth it. My son loved it as I'd hoped. I loved seeing it again. We even had a really beautiful lunch outdoors. It was a beautiful day. And then we were able to walk home a much more direct route once I'd kind of figured out where we were and calmed down. Because when you calm down, you can often find your way a lot better. So I got lost. I stressed. I panicked a little. But we got there in the end and it was all okay. And I'm pretty positive if I asked my son about that, he might remember going to the Hundertwasser House, but he would not remember that we'd got lost. So I think it was all okay in the end. But in any case, my little tale of getting lost in Vienna has absolutely nothing on the two stories I have coming up for you today from other travellers. They are, for me, kind of terrifying. If these experiences had happened to me, I don't know what I would have done. I might have stopped travelling altogether. So coming up first is a long-term blogging friend of mine, Leyla. Leyla and she blogs at Women on the Road. She lives in France now, has lived all over the world throughout her life. And I have to say she has some really kind of terrifying stories to tell about getting lost. She does a lot of solo travel and she has definitely had more than one interesting experience of being lost. Fortunately, she tells it in such an entertaining way that I don't feel too scared until I reflect upon it afterwards. But here's Leyla with some of her getting lost stories.
Getting lost is one of my absolute specialties. I somehow managed to do it whenever I go to places where you really, really could not get lost. I mean, I got lost in the Amazon. This was not fun. I was with, I know, who does that? I was with a group of local guides and they were taking me somewhere and clearly I was walking too slowly. So they just left me there and they took off.
That's hardly your fault then. I'm going to blame the local guides.
So they mumbled something, shoved a rifle into my hands and took off. Yeah, really? And so I wandered around for a bit and eventually I found these two little sort of huts and I walked over there and there were two children. There was a little girl and a boy who was a bit older. He must have been around 10 or 12. And I spoke sort of, passable Brazilian Portuguese at the time and I tried to speak to them. And they did not understand a word that I was saying. And I thought, oh, my God, they speak a local indigenous language and I'm going to be here forever. And I tried to mimic what a road looked like, what a car looked like, is there a road anywhere or a car? And they just looked at me with total incomprehension. So I sat down on a log and I thought, well, I need to get to grips with this. This is going to be my new life. I'm all of a sudden going to become an adjunct rubber tapper in the middle of the Amazon. And I wasn't too thrilled by the thought, and but eventually, after about 3 or 4 hours, these guys all showed up, happy, laughing, smelling of something that could have been alcohol, and just took a look at me and waved me on, and as though nothing had happened. They never said, "Oh, sorry, we left you behind." I mean, I think to them it was the most normal thing to do. Look, she's baggage. Let's just park her here for a while. And it never occurred to them that I could possibly be lost. So that was
or worried or concerned. Or...
Yeah, exactly. Different cultures, different attitudes. I'm sure they thought this was perfectly normal. And that I would be thrilled to have an extra few hours of siesta or something. I don't know. We didn't talk much after this, so there wasn't really much of an opportunity to find out what they thought. I was a little, let's just say I stayed in my corner for a while.
Yeah, I would too.
I think there's a pattern here because for some strange reason, people shove rifles into my hands and leave me abandoned in solitary places because another almost identical thing happened. And maybe it's because I'm a slow walker and I'm out of shape. I mean, that could be it.
But you seem
And this
so nice.
this was in Uganda. Yeah, I know. One doesn't preclude the other.
I guess not.
This one was in Uganda, and I was with the evil Simon, I'll call him. He was a local scientist. So he wasn't even local. He was British, actually. But for some reason, he had taken a strong dislike to me. And possibly this may have had to do with the fact that I also walk very slowly. Anyways, we went off to see mountain gorillas, as one does on a scientific project in the Ruwenzori Mountains in Uganda. And off we went. We saw our gorillas. It was wonderful. I spent 3 days getting soaked, walking up and down hills, because I discovered that gorillas don't walk around hills following valleys in a sensible way that they should. What they do is they just go up and down. So when you're tracking gorillas, you have to go up and down the hills and follow them. And I don't do hills very well. So after 3 days of that, it was time to go back to the scientific project station or whatever it's called. And off we went. And he starts telling me about the fact that this area has 32 wild elephants. And I'm thinking, 32 wild elephants. What are the chances that we're going to run into one, right? No, can't happen. And then he looks at me and he shoves a rifle into my hand again and says, just follow the path. I'm going on ahead, and left. And of course, I looked down. What path? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? I think he meant the sort of bent leaf and trampled grass. That was the path. So what should have taken me about half an hour or an hour from where I was ended up taking most of the day. And I wasn't in great shape because I kept thinking, I'm going to have a herd of 32 elephants surging out of nowhere and congregating around me. I know it.
Do you actually have any idea how to use these rifles that you keep getting
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Because
I didn't know whether they were loaded. Nothing. So I see absolutely no use in giving me one of those items. I suppose I could have swung it at something.
Sort of stabbed it at an
I've never fired. I've never fired a firearm in my life except in a country fair, and I don't think those were real bullets.
Yeah, I don't think that's probably good training for rifles against wild elephants. Oh, I'm glad you didn't have to try and
I'm a
use
lot
them.
better at getting lost, though.
Well, it's important to have a skill, isn't it?
Thank you. Thank you for recognizing that.
Oh, my goodness. I don't know what to say. Those are really kind of the two most bizarre getting lost stories I've ever heard.
Well, I have another one. Do you want another one?
I would love another one if it's anything like the first two. But I'm hoping it's not a third rifle. No, this one's a little different. Okay, go for it.
This one did not involve a rifle, but it did involve ammunition.
Of course it did.
Of course. I never realized my life was that exciting. This one involved getting lost in a minefield, and this was actually quite a harrowing experience. The other two were scary in their own way, but at no point did I actually think I was going to die within the next 5 minutes, whereas this one I did.
Wow.
And I was in Mozambique, and it was right after the civil war there, and the country was still heavily mined. And a lot of places had not even been approached by the deminers yet. And I was doing a story. I was there as a journalist, and I was doing a story on a completely devastated national park. And the park ranger was taking me around, and they had demined the main access road to the park. But he warned me very carefully, and he said, whatever you do, this is only demined to about a meter deep and half a meter on each side or something like that. I mean, he could have said anything. If you think I'm going to get out of the Jeep, you're nuts, right? I'm not going anywhere. It can be demined within an inch. I'm not moving. Yeah. So off we went on the access road, and we're driving around, and all of a sudden he looks down and he says, there is no road. And my mind's clicking along very quickly, thinking the road has been demined. There is no road. Therefore, we are not on the road. Therefore, we're in a minefield. Oh. Very easy calculation to make. And of course, we were right in the middle of a minefield. He'd lost the road somewhere along the line. And we were in this alluvial plain in this riverbed. And he just stopped the Jeep. And at this point, terror set in because he was too scared to move forward or backward. He was just frozen. And of course, I was, I was just ready to die. Now, I should add that on the way there, we had seen carcasses of old trucks blown up during the war. So we saw the results of what the landmines could do. It was still very vivid. I mean, this was, half an hour ago. I know what I'm going to look like when I fall back down to earth in little bits and pieces after we go over that landmine. So this is not a very happy moment. And so finally he started edging forward and we started driving, and our hearts are in our throats. I mean, at any moment we could be blown sky high. And so we see this bent palm and we rush to the bent palm and we're fine and we think that's the road. And of course it's not. And all the palms are bent and they all look alike. And we're driving around in circles, right? And eventually, he looked down and we saw two very faint tire tracks. And so, wow, we were on the road, and it was, I did actually get out of the Jeep. I got out, I threw up immediately.
Oh, did you really?
So
I'm not
terrified.
surprised.
Oh, I did, but he was crying, so I felt okay about that.
I think,
at least I wasn't crying. He was crying, and I was being sick.
I think they're both very reasonable reactions.
No kidding, and it's true, and you really do see your life flash before your eyes. And so we very, very slowly drove back and tried to stay on the road, and we'll forget about looking at the park. We just looked at the tires. Every 30 seconds we'd lean out to make sure that the tires were in the grooves. So yeah, that was another getting lost.
Wow. Well, I'm a little terrified by that one, but I was very happy to know that the end of the story was definitely going to have you alive, since I couldn't be speaking to you otherwise.
Because I'm here.
You see what I mean about Leyla's getting lost stories? I've never been in situations like those, and I really don't know how I would react, but I doubt that I would be as cool and calm as it sounded like Leyla was. Well, I actually have never got lost in the wilderness or the bush. I'm always ultra cautious, and I would never allow myself to be left alone there or head off somewhere alone. But my next guest did as well. So my next guest is Kiliii Fish. He's a photographer with an absolutely fascinating set of life experiences, I have to tell you. And he also takes amazing photos on his travels around the world. I'll add some links to his site and you can check them out in the show notes. So I asked him as well about his experiences of getting lost, and interestingly, it was one of the first times he got lost that he was the most scared.
Have you ever been lost somewhere and been terrified?
I have. I have definitely been lost and terrified. Most of the getting lost and really scared stuff has happened to me not while I was working as a photographer, but mostly when I'm out on wilderness experiences. Because I used to be involved in the survival skills world, I was often in places where there's no help at all. When you get lost, you're really counting on your ability, your skill set in terms of figuring out where the directions are and all that. But I think that the place where I've been the most lost and kind of the most terrified is probably the very first time I've been lost, and I bet that's the way it is for most people.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, that first time you get lost, you're not expecting to get lost, right? I mean, the more times you kind of, at some point, getting lost, sort of just in your attitude, you eventually just say, "Oh, okay, this is not getting lost. I'm on an adventure."
Exactly right. Yes. What am I going to discover in getting out of this mess? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going on an adventure, that kind of thing. But the very first time I got lost, I was out with a girlfriend, and we were camping in a pretty remote old-growth forest on the east coast of the United States, which is one of the very few old-growth forests left. And it's a pretty big area, and we were at the top of a hill, and it was starting to get dark. Okay, so first problem.
Yes, it's a problem.
I figured I was going to go fetch some water for cooking, and it was towards sunset, so you know how this goes.
I'm a bit worried about how this goes. Yes.
Yeah. So I hiked down this pretty steep hill to fetch water, and I know that there's a creek or a river running down there somewhere because I had heard it earlier, and I knew it was down there. So I hiked way down, and just using the landscape, it's obvious that the water is down at the lowest point.
Yes, that's logical even for me as a city dweller. Yes.
Right. And so I have a 5-gallon bucket, and I get down to the bottom, and I it's dry down there, but I can tell that the ground is a little bit wet at the base of this, where the two mountains or the two hills meet. And so I start walking down this little funnel, hoping to find it where it gets bigger, and then it gets really dark, and really dark. And when you're in an old growth forest, very little of the light reaches the ground. So you get this period of like really intense, complete pitch blackness where even if there's a little bit of moon or starlight, it's just completely black, And so I was walking around and I figured, well, I'm out here. I've got a long sleeve shirt on, and that's it. And it was springtime, so I figured, I got to keep going, and I'm not going back without water.
Very determined of you.
Yeah, so like a fool.
Possibly, but some would say persistent.
I walked out a little bit in the pitch black, and then the next thing I know, I'm waist deep in water, and I can barely move.
Oh no!
So I'd fallen into some kind of bog or something like that. And I was just moving around. I could feel that there were a lot of water plants all around me. And I had no idea where anything was, and there was just a little bit of moonlight, enough like little bits and spots where it kind of poked through because of the river or because of the water. So there weren't trees overhead.
Not so many trees there. Yeah.
And so, yeah, exactly. And so, I was looking around and I figured, okay, well, great. What do I do? So I started to feel around for the land. But, the funny thing is it seemed like the land just completely vanished. Wherever I was going, it seemed to either get deeper or it was back the way I had come. And so I just kept stumbling around. And then sure enough, after about 10 or 15 minutes of doing this, the mosquitoes found me.
Oh, no.
And that's when I realized I was really, truly in a bog, when you stick around for a little bit. And it's springtime, so this is not really heavy insects yet, but they were coming, and oh my God, they got to be really intense with the buzzing, and I was pretty freaked out. I was like, okay, what's going to happen? I'm in cold water, and there's bugs flying around.
They're going to eat me alive.
Yeah, they're going to eat me alive. I'm going to be stuck here. Here I am in quicksand or whatever it is.
My poor girlfriend at the top of the mountain.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about her. She was fine. I was like, oh, it was me.
Alone, but fine.
Right. Although I did know I was going to be in big trouble when I got back, especially if I showed up without water.
I think if you come back covered in mosquito bites and muddy, boggy stuff, she should be a bit sympathetic.
Yeah, you say that now.
Oh my goodness! So what happened?
So I eventually wandered around enough. I was lucky enough to actually kind of wander into some roots and just kind of pull myself along until I found the land, and I got up onto land. But I was still completely lost, and so I kept stumbling around for a bit, kept walking, which is definitely not what you're supposed to do. So as a formal survival skills instructor, I have to say, do not wander around in the dark.
Yes, the lessons we learn after the fact.
That's right. But I wandered around for a very good long time, and finally I've had the wherewithal to dump the mucky bog water I was carrying, and that really changed things around when I did that. Because I wasn't off balance and carrying this heavy water I was trying not to spill, and so I got rid of the water, carried the bucket, and at a certain point, it started to get really cold, and even the bugs started to die down. And I figured, okay, I might have to spend a night out here, but I really don't want to because I don't have enough clothing. I might not, I might just freeze to death.
Exactly.
So at that certain point, something in your head clicks, it kind of switches over, and it's like, okay, no one else is going to find this or fix this for you. You have to fix this for yourself. You have to make some decisions.
Wow.
And so I figured, okay, well, you got to think, man. And I kind of knew that I was far enough. I wasn't so far away from my girlfriend that she might not be able to hear me. I was thinking oh well, I'm not up top at the top of a hill, but I knew that I hadn't really gone that far because I was probably wandering around in circles down in the boggy area, and I hadn't really gone that far because I was constantly tripping and falling into the bog, So I imagined that maybe I was at the most a half kilometer away from her, and probably not even that, maybe a quarter kilometer. So I just started. I kind of got up to the highest point I could, and faced One Direction yelled very loudly, and then I waited for about 15 seconds, turned 90 degrees, yelled very loudly, and then did that, just did the rotation. And, I didn't hear anything. So I kept moving upwards and kept doing that. And that, sure enough, at some point, probably after about 40 minutes of doing this or so, I actually heard a response.
Wow.
Back. Yeah. And, it was really late. Probably if I had been much longer, the sun would have been rising already.
Which would have made everything a lot easier, but still.
Right? And it is amazing at nighttime in the forest. It's very difficult to tell which direction sounds are coming from, and so it really helped to shout and wait to listen to which response would get an answer, because even when I could hear her, it sounded like it was coming from behind me, but it had to go on faith and realize that if I was shouting in a direction, that was where she could hear me from.
Yes,
and so that was the only way that I could do it. And so it worked out. I got back there, and it was not much earlier than that, much earlier than the sunrise.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah, it was a terrible, terrible night. I was covered in insect bites and very, very cold.
Oh, it sounds terrifying. But I guess you proved to yourself that, like you say, something kicks in and you have to figure it out yourself, and you did, and that probably stood you in good stead for plenty of later adventures in life.
Yeah, definitely. And, you learn, I think, ultimately, one of the most important things I took away from that is that when you're on your own, and when you're out, you have to just get your head together and think about stuff. Just calm down and think about stuff. And it's often not that difficult to figure out what you can do, like just using common sense.
Yeah, it's a bit of a kind of a curse of modern society, even for simple things that we go for help so quickly now. Even simple things like, I can't remember, I don't know, the capital of Portugal. I'll quickly Google it instead of just thinking through your brain and sort of extrapolating that further to think, we just don't bother to think things through on our own anymore. So it's probably a really good experience to get back to nature a bit more often and be on your own and remember that actually we have way more capacity than we probably expect of ourselves.
That's certainly true. Yep, definitely. And nature is a very fine crucible.
Yes, isn't it just so true? Yeah.
Well, I'm really glad that all of that happened to Kiliii and not to me. But I do really like his summary that when you're in a situation like that, you learn that you have to fix this for yourself. And I think that's one of the great lessons of travel in many situations, whether you're getting lost in the wilderness or not, just that you actually have the power to fix these things for yourself. You can find an inner strength that you just don't always realize you have until you're put in a situation like that, and travel tends to put you in those situations more often. So I hope you've enjoyed these two really interesting guests and their stories about getting lost, and I of course would love to hear any stories you have about getting lost on your travels. So do please leave me a comment at the show notes at notaballerina.com/01, or look up the Not a Ballerina Facebook page, or you could tweet me at Amanda Kendall using the Thoughtful Travel Pod hashtag. I'm really keen to hear about your getting lost stories, be they positive or negative. So thank you very much for listening to episode 2 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'd like to thank my two lovely guests and tell you a little bit more about where you can find them. So Leyla Alyanak has been designing a toolkit for solo women travellers for years. So she's got so much information on her site at www.womenontheroad.com. It's basically everything a woman needs to know to travel on her own. If you haven't travelled on your own, I would so encourage it. It's not something I get to do very often, but when I do, I really do love it. My second guest was Kiliii Fish. Now, that's Kiliii with 3 I's on the end. I think 3 I's on the end is the coolest name ever. Kiliii. And you can find him at www.kiliii.com, Kiliii. And he's also a great user of Instagram at Kiliii Fish. And of course, as always, these details and more are in the show notes. And for this episode, they'll be at www.notaballerina.com/02. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM.
For your ears.
Who is that? Hi, podcast.